Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Everybody should have gotten these sheets, the handout sheets. This is just what I put on the blackboard last week. So now I thought it would make it easier and more convenient to consult if you had it in a printed form. And then you have two versions, the English version on the top. There's an English version on the top and the Pali equivalent below. So you can learn the technical Pali terms. Okay, so we are continuing now with the study of Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 2, the Sabbāsava Sutta. And last time I completed the discussion of the section, if you remember, the summary or opening of the sutta, where the Buddha lays down, it's called the table of contents. He mentioned 7 ways in which taints should be or can be abandoned. The first of these are the taints to be abandoned by seeing, that is, by the seeing of the truth. And so far we've covered the discussion of these taints, the taints that should be abandoned by seeing. It actually turns out that literally there aren't taints that should be abandoned by seeing, if we take the 3 principal taints. But what is to be abandoned by seeing are the first 3 fetters, the first 3 of the 10 fetters that bind a person to the round of samsara, the round of rebirth. And these taints are to be abandoned, or these fetters to be abandoned, through wise attention, and what one attends to wisely is the 4 Noble Truths. And this wise attention to the 4 Noble Truths corresponds to, this is an important point, to the samadhi factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. In fact, the word dasana here, seeing, and the word ditti, which means view, are both stemming off from the same verbal root in Pali. The root is das. And so you get the noun, the action noun, dasana, seeing, from the root das. It's the action noun. Dasana, seeing. And then it gives more substantive noun, ditti, which is view. Ditti is somewhat more comprehensive in that it includes right view, a view as, to say, opinion, understanding that accords with the truth. And it also, right view, means the actual seeing of the truth. But when one gains the seeing, when one experiences the actual seeing of the 4 Noble Truths, at the same time one acquires experiential right view, or penetrative right view. And that way one firmly establishes the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, so it becomes invincible, that it can never be shaken by anything or by anyone in the world. That is why the Sotapanna, the stream enterer, has the right view that will definitely lead on to final liberation. That view can never be changed, can never be altered. Even there's a story in the commentaries where somebody listening to laymen in the tongue of the Buddha, listening to the Buddha preach. He's listening, the Buddha preaches the Dhamma, and he gains stream entry. He gets that super mundane, world transcending right view. Then Mara wishes to cause him to fall down, to fall away from his attainment. So Mara takes on the appearance of the Buddha and comes to his house, calls on his house and says, "Lay disciple, previously you heard me preaching that all conditioned things are impermanent." Well, I didn't quite mean it that way. What I really meant is that some things are impermanent and there are some other things that you can enjoy permanently, some things you could hold on to permanently. And before I said that all things should be taken as non-self, should be understood as non-self, well, again, you have to understand that as with qualifications. There was a statement that needs interpretation. Some things are non-self, but there are some other things you could take as self. And then when the layman heard this, because his right view is so firmly established, even though to all appearances the Buddha was standing right in front of him, telling him some conditioned things are permanent, some things can be taken as self, but he realized, this can't be the Buddha. And he said, "Are you Mara?" And then when Mara's number is called, he can't lie. He has to reveal himself. So when the layman called Mara's number, then Mara had to confess and say, "Yes, I am Mara." And then Mara disappeared on the spot. So maybe the story is purely fictional, but it illustrates how strong the right view of extreme enter is. Okay, now we come to the next section. This is called Taint to be Abandoned by Restraining. And here the word for restraining or restraint is Dhamma. What is being referred to is a particular practice called Indriya Dhamma. That means the restraint of the sense faculty. But let us notice something that comes right at the very beginning. Okay, what taint bhikkhus should be abandoned by restraining? Here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, abides with the eye faculty restrained. And now I want to call your attention to something. It's an interesting point that just struck my attention this afternoon. Okay, if you look up on the page, paragraph 9, where the Buddha is introducing the taint to be abandoned by seeing, he says, "Bhikkhus, a well-taught, noble disciple, a well-instructed, noble disciple," and so on and so on and so on. And now, technically, in the discourses, in the suttas, the expression noble disciple doesn't distinguish between monks and lay people. But anyone who is a disciple, a follower of the Buddha, can be called a noble disciple. And actually that tends to be probably, if one did a very careful study of the text, the tendency for the text to use noble disciple specifically, or more often with reference to a lay disciple than to a monk. So in many contexts it would also include a monk. But now when we come to the taint to be abandoned by restraining in the following passages, they're all spoken of with reference to the bhikkhu, to the monk. Now this is the way I would understand this distinction. Now in the Buddha's time, probably maybe for generations after, the Buddha would seek to bring lay disciples through his discourses to the level of stream enterer. This was not considered a specifically monastic attainment, but there were many, according to the text, many lay disciples of the Buddha, male lay disciples, upasikas, women lay disciples, upasikas, who heard the Buddha preach, and practiced the Dhamma, and reached the level of stream enterer. Even reached the level of once returner, the level of non-returner. A few cases recorded of lay disciples who reached the stage of arhat. But when they reached the stage of arhat, either very soon after, within days, they ordained, or within days they passed away. But they don't continue to live on as, after reaching arhatship, they don't continue to live on as householders. It's just not possible. And so now, the key factor for the attainment of stream entry is the seeing of the truth of the Dhamma. Of course, to see the truth of the Dhamma, generally, one has to have the right preparatory conditions, which would be good moral discipline, a clear mind, and a well-developed faculty of wisdom through previous lives. In other words, one would have to have what we call paramis, well-developed spiritual qualities over previous lives. But what is the trigger point for the attainment of stream entry is this seeing of the Dhamma. And when the Buddha teaches the Dhamma, when spiritually advanced disciples teach the Dhamma, those who listen, who have the right supporting conditions and who listen, are capable of giving rise to that Dhamma Chakku, the eye of Dhamma, and of reaching the penetration of the Dhamma. They don't have to be great meditators or great renunciants, great meditators, but just somehow, I don't really know how it happens, but we read in the text that a disciple or a person is sitting there. Sometimes it could be a person meeting the Buddha for the first time, and the Buddha is preaching the Dhamma. As the person is sitting there, they feel trust and confidence in the Buddha. Their mind becomes very clear while the Buddha is preaching. And when the Buddha is preaching, then he's able to understand their mind, and he knows it. Then, when he's directing the teaching to them, he'll explain the key points of the teaching, particularly the Four Noble Truths. And just when the Buddha explains the truth, then that person or those people, with the right conditions, they get the Dhamma Chakku, the vision of the Dhamma, the seeing of the truth. And also, as this discourse, this sutta makes out, we're seeing that those who have the right faith, the capacity for, in this case, for wise attention, careful attention, would be able to attend to things properly in such a way that they gain that essential vision or seeing of the Four Noble Truths. And it doesn't require specific monastic training, doesn't require all the rules of discipline, probably doesn't require a high level of attainment in the sphere of samadhi, but just enough concentration for this wise attention to be able to trigger off, to ignite that insight or that realization of the Four Truths. Okay, but now once the person has reached the level of stream entry, it seems the rest of the discourse, the rest of the sutta, is intended to show what are the remaining steps to be followed to bring that person from the stage of stream entry to the stage of arhatship. So one should also add that it doesn't mean that these other 6 practices should be undertaken only when a person becomes a stream enterer. But for those who undertake the monastic discipline, and even those who want to train themselves as lay people to the best of their ability in accordance with the spirit of the monastic discipline, then they should also try to practice these other 6 ways of overcoming the asavas. But the way I would understand the reason why the taints or asavas be eliminated by seeing, they are described with reference to the well-taught noble disciple, while the elimination of the other taints or asavas is described with reference to a bhikkhu. And if you remember, in my first talk on the sutta, I said that of the 7 ways of overcoming the asavas, 2 of them are concerned with the actual abandoning or destruction. I use the word abandoning in a general sense. 2 of them are concerned with the destruction of the asavas, and the other 5 with the restraining of the asavas. The ones that are concerned with the destruction or elimination of the asavas are seeing and development. The other 5 are concerned or cultivated for the purpose of restraining the asavas. Okay, so now we come to taints to be abandoned by restraining. I continue. Here, a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, abides with the eye faculty restrained, while taint, vexation, and fever might arise in one who abides with the eye faculty unrestrained. There are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who abides with the eye faculty restrained. Then the same thing is explained with regard to the other 5 sense faculties: the ear faculty, nose, tongue, body faculty, and mind faculty. Then the general statement: while taint, vexation, and fever might arise in one who abides with the faculties, the sense faculties, unrestrained, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who abides with the faculties restrained. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by restraining. This passage very closely resembles another standard passage that comes in the suttas on the restraint of the sense faculties. We already had it, for example, in sutta number 27, the simile of the elephant's footprint, and paragraph number... Okay, now this passage mentions what happens when one dwells with the sense faculties unrestrained. Then it says asavas, that's the taints or influxes. Then something translated here, vexation. The Pali expression vigata can be translated disturbances or distress. And parilaha means a burning, a fever, an inward burning. And now the usual passage on sense restraint that we have in Sutta number 27 says that if one, for example, if one left the eye faculty unguarded, evil, unwholesome states of longing and dejection might invade the mind. And we know that longing or covetousness is a synonym for greed or craving, and dejection implies the presence of displeasure, ill will, dissatisfaction. And I think we could see these two terms, vexation and fever, as paralleling longing and dejection, but inverted. Vexation, vigasa, vexation, distress, disturbance, seems to go along with displeasure or domanassa, dejection, displeasure. While fever, this burning, goes along with covetousness, greed, or craving. And so when one dwells with the senses unrestrained, when one meets pleasant objects, then there comes this attraction to them, and if that attraction, desire, becomes strong enough, it turns into the burning of lust and desire, craving. And if they're unpleasant, disagreeable objects, then it causes displeasure, vexation, distress, disturbance. And then the word asavas here, I have to admit, I find it a little bit troublesome. But, well, the commentary comes to my rescue for a change. That it gives various meanings of asavas, and it says that they don't have to be taken in this according to the standard list of the 3 or 4 asavas, but it says in some cases the word asava can just mean any kind of misfortune or misery. And so maybe in this passage we could take it in that broader sense of misfortune and misery. So the commentary also tries to explain how the 3 regular asavas arise in regard to somebody who lacks restraint of the senses. Okay, when one has a pleasant object, when one sees a pleasant object, then there will arise the influx of sensual desire. Or if one is thinking that one will experience this pleasant objects like this in some future existence, there comes the desire to experience objects like this in some future existence. That's the influx of desire for existence. And then because one is deluded about the situation, that is the influx of ignorance. Do you have any ideas about this? But as I see, one can tie it in with the 3 asavas here. But I think when we have this expression, asava, vigasa, parilaha, pain, vexation, and fever, to my mind it does have that broader meaning. Any kind of misfortune or misery. Okay, and so when one restrains the sense faculties, then one gains this, I would call it, a mastery over external, so that one is not subject to the sway of sense impressions. When pleasant objects come into range, because one has this restraint of the senses, one is not drawn in, sucked in by them. When unpleasant objects impinge on the senses, one is not cast down by them. And an important point in the practice of sense restraint, according to the Buddha's teaching, I said this before, it doesn't mean not to see, not to hear, not to smell, not to taste, not to feel. Well, it's possible. There were ascetic groups at the time of the Buddha who tried to practice sense restraint by always keeping the eyes closed except when absolutely necessary to open them, keeping the ears stuffed with wax or other substance so that one doesn't hear anything except when one has to speak, then one can remove them. And they thought this is the way the true noble ones practice sense restraint. I don't know what they did with the nose. They had to eat. But they tried to limit contact with the eyes and the ears. But for the Buddha, the real key factor is the mind. So one has to keep the mind under control. And one does this by avoiding grasping. The Buddha uses the expression that one avoids grasping upon the signs and features of things, grasping upon the distinctive, attractive, or repulsive objects, the distinctive, attractive, and repulsive features of things. And one avoids dwelling upon the detailed aspects of things that will reinforce the initial attraction or aversion. The most important thing is to control the mind so that one can interact with objects of the senses without being drawn in and controlled. Any questions about this? Jim? At first, I don't think the practice of sense restraint would require one to avoid what we call innocent enjoyment of objects of the senses. Well, that's a little difficult. Excuse me? I was also going to say, I didn't quite complete what I was going to say. I was also going to say that the practice of sense restraint doesn't prohibit the innocent enjoyment of objects of the senses, and I was going to continue and say, at the same time, there can be subtle types of attachment, subtle types of sensual indulgence that we might not be aware of at the gross level, but when one is really intent upon training the mind to gain complete mental mastery, then what seems to be innocent enjoyment of sense objects will appear to be something of an impediment towards that effort of mental. Yeah. There's no contradiction at all between the practice of sublime compassion or love and the practice of sense restraint. But what is the instruction being given here is to restrain the senses from those objects that will cause the influx, the flowing in of attachment or craving and aversion. And even to develop the higher levels of love and compassion requires mastery of those impulses towards craving and aversion. Okay, then I will go on to the next section. Okay, these are the taints or asavas. Now coming to light, I'm coming to prefer the expression influxes to taints. What are the influxes to be abandoned by using? And here this is again, it explained with reference to the monk. And there are 4 objects that are called the 4 requisites of the monastic life. That is, robes, alms food, dwelling place, and medicinal requisites. In fact, even for everyday life, these are the main supports of life. And so, for a monastic person, when one uses these four basic requisites, one has to do so with a wise attention to the proper use for which they're intended. And in our training as young monks, these are standard reflections that we are taught to do every day. In fact, in many of the monasteries in Sri Lanka, this is recited as part of the daily routine 2 or 3 times a day. All the monks get together as part of the daily service or liturgy. These passages are recited. And then also when sitting for the meal, the monks will recite the reflection on the alms food together. So here, a monk reflecting wisely uses the robe only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with flies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things. That refers to snakes, serpents. And only for the purpose of concealing the private parts. There's no great fashion in monastic robes. There's no changing fall fashion, winter fashion, spring fashion, summer fashion. So don't forget when you go to Sri Lanka, get me that maroon colored robe, burgundy colored robe that I like so much. These orange colored robes. Okay, then for the alms food, he uses alms food not for the sake of amusement. People take different. Now we're going to take this day. We take Indian food. Now we go out to an Italian restaurant. Now we go to a Chinese restaurant. Here we go to Chinese restaurants every day. Except last week we had a Burmese Indian man here cooking, so for a change we had Indian food. But one takes the food not for enjoying oneself, not for intoxication with the flavor, the taste of the food. Now the next two are interesting. In the Pali it says, Neva Mandanaya Navibhusanaya, which we have to translate not for the sake of physical beauty and attractiveness. Literally, it's not for the sake of ornamenting oneself, beautifying oneself. And this has always been something of a problem, even when I first read this. And then the explanation we get, it comes in the commentaries, the Magga. It's not for the sake of physical beauty. That is, as the commentaries say, in the time of India, people would eat a lot of food because fatness was considered a sign of beauty. So they would eat a lot in order to get plump, have plump limbs, plump belly, and that would make them, other people would then consider themselves to be beautiful. And not for the sake of attractiveness. One eats certain foods in order to make the skin clear and shiny. One eats other foods in order to make the muscles strong and firm. It always struck me as a rather contrived explanation, but what can one do? I have no other way to go about understanding this passage. But then just very recently I learned from some of my erudite friends who know the Chinese Agamas that in the Chinese Agama version, these two qualities, these two aspects, come in relation to the robe rather than alms food. One doesn't use the robe for the sake of physical beauty and attractiveness. And that seems to me more sensible than in relation to alms food. Okay, but the rest, continues, the rest is quite comprehensible. One uses the food only for the endurance or maintenance and continuance of this body, for ending discomfort, and for supporting the spiritual life, the holy life. Considering, thus I shall terminate old feelings. By eating the food, one eliminates the old feelings of hunger without arousing new feelings of craving, of enjoying, delighting in the taste of the food. And I shall be healthy and blameless, and shall live in comfort or in good health. Okay, then reflecting wisely, he uses the resting place or dwelling place only for protection from cold, for protection from heat, for protection from contact with flies, mosquitoes, wind and sun, and creeping things, again, that's snakes, and only for the purpose of warding off the perils of climate. I mean, wind, strong wind, we have wind already, rain, cold, we have cold, and so on, and for enjoying retreat, that is, enjoying solitary meditation. And then reflecting wisely, one uses the medicinal requisites only for protection from arisen afflicting feelings and for the benefit of good health. And so, if one uses the requisites without reflecting wisely in this way, then taint, vexation, and fever might arise. But when one uses them reflecting wisely, then there are no taints, no influxes, vexation, or fever. These are the taints that should be abandoned by using. Any questions about this? Okay, then go on to the next passage. The taints to be abandoned by enduring. Here, enduring means enduring with patience, patiently enduring. And this was especially important for the monks during the Buddha's time, because in those days one didn't, well, they did have monasteries, but they were not so strong and well constructed as modern monasteries, but monks would live often in very simple huts, kutis, we call kutis. But often they would live in the monasteries only for the period of the rainy season, 3 or 4 months. Then they would spend much of the year just wandering from place to place, having often to walk through forests, jungles, over long stretches where they would have to endure cold, wind, hot sun. And so they would have to use this wise reflection in order to strengthen their will and to develop patience. So reflecting wisely, the monk bears cold and heat, hunger and thirst. In those days, the monks would go on alms rounds, generally just once a day. If one is going to a new area, people don't have food prepared, so you might just get bits and scraps of food, and that might have to sustain one for the whole day until the next day. Sometimes one might go if one is wandering over through a forest, one might have to go for days without seeing a village, and no opportunity to eat. You have to endure hunger and thirst, and again, flies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and creeping things. And then one comes into contact with those who are not favorably disposed to Buddhism. Northern India was not a Buddhist country, but the whole population favorably disposed to the Buddha. Often they would come to villages and towns full of supporters of the Brahmins, and they would be hostile to the Buddha and to Buddhism. So you would get ill-spoken, unwelcome words. And then sometimes one would have to endure a lot of bodily pain, illness. So there would arise bodily feelings that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, menacing to life. And so for one who does not have strong patience, strong capacity for endurance, then there will arise especially vexation, irritation, distress under these difficult conditions. But for one who is able to arouse that mind of patience, endurance, then these things will not arise. So these are the taints that should be abandoned by enduring. Next come taints to be abandoned by avoiding. Okay, so what are the taints to be abandoned by avoiding? Here, a monk, reflecting wisely, avoids, quite sensibly, a wild elephant, a wild horse, wild bull, a wild dog, a snake, a stump with sharp spikes that one might, if one steps on it, and one will cut one's teeth, a bramble patch, a chasm, a cliff, a cesspit, a sewer. These are things that wandering monks would often encounter as they roam the countryside from town to town. Reflecting wisely, he avoids sitting on unsuitable seats. There are certain seats considered unsuitable for a monk, but one has to, as a monk, one has to protect one's own reputation and the reputation of the order. And so one doesn't want to arouse the suspicion of others. So the Buddha has laid down certain rules about seats. Sitting alone, for a monk to be sitting alone with a woman in a secluded place where other people cannot see. If people should happen just to see from a distance, then that would arouse suspicion. And then one should avoid wandering to unsuitable, and the same would apply, of course, for nuns in relation to males. Wandering to unsuitable resource. Like in the towns where the Buddha's monks would go for alms round, there would be certain sections where there would be taverns and people with bad reputations would go. We used to have a Bowery in New York. In certain districts considered improper places for monastic persons to go, and so it would not be suitable for a monastic person to go to such places on alms round or on social visits. And one should avoid associating with bad friends, those people who might lead one astray. Of course, if there are bad people and one thinks that one could benefit them by teaching them the Dhamma, transforming them, then one can associate with them. But what is meant here is associating with them on the level of fellowship as peers, so that you might become under their influence and they might turn you around and lead you off the right track. Okay, so the reason given, if one were to do so, then one's wise companions in the holy life might suspect one of evil conduct or wrong conduct. Okay, well, taint, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not avoid these things. There are no taint, vexation, and fever in one who avoids them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding. Any questions about this? Okay, paragraph number 20. What taints should be abandoned by removing? Here a monk, reflecting wisely, does not tolerate an arisen thought of sensual desire. He abandons it, removes it, does away with it, and annihilates it. He does not tolerate an arisen thought of ill will, does not tolerate an arisen thought of cruelty or harming. He does not tolerate arisen evil, unwholesome states. He abandons them, removes them, does away with them, and annihilates them. Okay, the first three types of thoughts mentioned, these are the three types of, we call miccha sankappa, wrong thoughts, which are opposed to the threefold right thoughts of the Noble Eightfold Path. And so in the practice of mental cultivation, when thoughts of these three types arise, then one who is training diligently has to not tolerate them, not allow them to pass into the mind unobserved, unresisted. But one has to use one of the techniques, many techniques that the Buddha mentioned, of abandoning them or removing them. Sometimes even just mindful observation can be considered a technique of abandoning them. Since when one observes the thoughts mindfully, then one is deflating them, preventing them from gathering momentum. But when the thought becomes more persistent, then one might have to use some special technique directly opposed to that thought. Sometimes one might even have to use force and act of will to drive the unwholesome thoughts out of the mind. And in the fourth state mentioned, or fourth aspect mentioned here, is just an umbrella term for including all other unwholesome states. He does not tolerate any arisen, evil, unwholesome states, whatever they might be, but again he abandons them and so forth and annihilates them. And this, what's involved here especially, is the application of right effort. This is the right effort of the four types of right effort. This is the right effort of dispelling arisen unwholesome states. All the other methods that we've come across, from two methods, pertains to be abandoned by restraint, to be abandoned by using, by enduring, by avoiding. We could say these are the methods that come under the first factor of right effort, to prevent the arising of unarisen, unwholesome states. Okay, and now we come to the seventh method for overcoming the taints. These are the taints to be abandoned by developing. Okay, here a bhikkhu, reflecting wisely, develops the mindfulness enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, dispassion and cessation, and ripens in relinquishment. He develops the investigation of state enlightenment factor. Repeat. the energy enlightenment factor, the rapture enlightenment factor, the tranquility enlightenment factor, the concentration enlightenment factor. He developed the equanimity enlightenment factor, which is supported by seclusion, translates very closely, supported by dispassion, supported by cessation, and ripens in, or better, evolves towards relinquishment. Mindfulness, investigation of faith, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. I count 7. Mindfulness is the first. If you're counting just on page 96, then I like to use the whole. No order. No, I'm not with a question mark. You're saying there's no order. Yeah, I'm sure the order. Yeah, first is definitely there is a very definite order in the development of the enlightenment practice. That here one begins with mindfulness, and now the unfolding of the enlightenment practice seems to imply a fairly high stage in the development of the path, especially when they're all described by these qualifications based upon, supported by seclusion, dispassion and cessation, ripening and relinquishment. It seems to imply that the enlightenment practices have already gained some degree of strength. So one begins now with mindfulness, and this would be attending to one or another of the four foundations of mindfulness, or objective domains of mindfulness. We're, of course, taking in all of them. Now, as mindfulness starts to build up, then one becomes more clearly aware of the factors in one's own mind, so that one could see more distinctly what are the unwholesome qualities of mind, what are the wholesome qualities of mind, what are the dark states, the bright states, the commendable state, what are the undesirable mental states, what are the desirable mental qualities that one wants to develop. One is able to distinguish among the states of mind that are constantly arising, and one is able to divide the qualities of one's mind, to understand them and to discriminate amongst them, to distinguish what is unwholesome, what is wholesome. That is the initial, I call the beginning, the initial application of the investigation of state enlightenment practice. And as one discriminates amongst these mental states, then one applies energy to remove the unwholesome state and to strengthen, to reinforce, develop the wholesome mental state. So now the energy or effort, enlightenment factor is coming into being. Virya sambojjhanga. And now as energy increases, one is able to sustain that mindfulness for longer and longer periods, and the mind becomes clearer, more observant, mindfulness more continuous. And so there comes, as one is able to sustain that mindfulness, there comes more joy, happiness in the practice. That is the arising of the piti, enlightenment factor. The enlightenment factor of joy, rapture, elation, I call it mental elation. And this has various degrees till the mind can become flooded and inundated with this joy. But these floods of joy are somewhat disturbing because they have the quality of excitement. It has the quality of excitement, joy or rapture. But as one goes on just attending with mindfulness, the excitable edge of that joy quiets down and the mind becomes calm and tranquil. So now the passaddhi enlightenment factor is emerging, the enlightenment factor of tranquility or calmness. And as the mind becomes more and more tranquil, then a deep, quiet happiness wells up within the mind. And the mind, as that deep, quiet happiness permeates the mind, then the mind just naturally settles upon its object and becomes focused and one-pointed. That is the arising of the concentration enlightenment factor. And then as concentration deepens, then the little fluctuations that are a disturbance to concentration, those subside, and the mind becomes increasingly balanced and poised. This, we could say, means the emergence and fluorescence, flowering, blossoming of the equanimity enlightenment factor. Okay, I could hear. Okay, it's saying, is this a state where there's no object but just oneness? Is that the question? No, there's always an object. And this is now somebody who is developing the four foundations of mindfulness in order to develop insight. And so one will be contemplating whatever object within the range of the four foundations of mindfulness comes within the sphere or the domain of attention. Even when there's deep concentration, then the mind will not be moving to other objects, but one still has that object which is the object of concentration. So the mind might be so quiet because thinking and conceptualization has subsided that it seems that there's no object but just oneness. But in fact, as long as there's mind, there's always an object of mind. Okay, Suki? Vichaya. Yeah. As I understand it, initially there's conceptualization, definitely conceptualization, in the stage where one is distinguishing the states of mind as wholesome, unwholesome, desirable, undesirable, dark and bright with their counterparts. But the way I understand it, that is the initial, what I call the initial application of investigation of phenomena, Dhamma Vichaya. But in the development of insight, Dhamma Vichaya, this investigation of phenomena, will continue all the way through. In fact, we should not think of the 7 factors of enlightenment as a series of steps. One arises, then that falls away and gets replaced by the next one. But it's rather one arises, built upon its predecessor, but the predecessor remains. And so as the next one arises, those that come earlier remain and persist until they are all functioning together. And as later factors of enlightenment emerge, earlier ones take on different functions, more refined functions. Like the initial function of investigation is to distinguish the states of mind as being wholesome, unwholesome, desirable, undesirable, and so on. But as one goes on developing the practice of the Satipatthana, the foundations of mindfulness, till the experiential field becomes very clear and sharp, then one doesn't have to attend to one's states of mind from that perspective anymore, but one can just attend to the phenomena arising and passing, arising and passing. Then one is still investigating phenomena, but one is not so much concerned with wholesome, unwholesome states of mind, but with what is the characteristics, the nature of phenomena. And one is exploring the characteristics of arising and passing, impermanence, their instability, their selfless nature. Perception in the sense of sanya. Perception is there all the way through. Yeah. Okay, but I wanted to finish this Viveka Nisitang formula. That's what I was going to do. Okay, this is a formula that, as I said, indicates, or I take it to indicate, a fairly high development of the enlightenment factors. The commentary gives a rather elaborate explanation of them. I won't try to explain it, it's pretty technical. Well, maybe I'll just explain it in a rather simpler way. Well, maybe I'll give my own understanding. Okay, in my own understanding, there seems to be a sequence involved in these 3 terms. Viveka, Viraga, Nirodha. Okay, Viveka is seclusion. And the implication is that to develop the enlightenment factors, one goes into seclusion. First, it's kind of physical seclusion. And then seclusion is also spoken of with reference to the mind. The mind becomes secluded from unwholesome states. And as the enlightenment factors develop further strength, they become, okay, in the initial stage, one is developing them based upon the seclusion, the bodily, physical seclusion, when one goes into it, withdraws, into retreats, practice them, and mental seclusion. one is clearing the mind of unwholesome states in order to develop them. Then viraga, nisitam, one is developing them based upon an increasing dwindling of passion, fading away of passion. One becomes increasingly free from the grip of passions or cravings. Then nirodha nisitam. Well, I don't know if this way of explanation will work. One develops them based upon, here one would have to say, the aspiration or inclination towards nirodha as cessation of suffering, the aspiration or inclination towards nibbana. And then they are, so saga parinaming, that would mean evolving on, rolling on towards, or giving up, relinquishing of all attachment, of all objects of clinging. Okay, the way the commentary explains it, it doesn't really they don't distinguish very much between viveka, viraga, and nirodha. It just says that all three are basically synonyms, and that one is developing them, the enlightenment factors based upon these three things when practicing insight meditation. One is developing them based upon this in the sense that it takes these three to be synonyms for nibbana, and one is developing them based upon these three things during the phase of insight, in that the mind is inclining towards nibbana. And at the moment when one reaches the world-transcending path, the supramundane path, one is developing them in the sense that they are now taking nibbana as their object of realization. And then they're said to be evolving on towards relinquishment or letting go, in that as one develops them, one is abandoning the defilements, letting go of the defilements, and letting oneself go by taking the plunge into nibbana, leaping, so launching out into nibbana, leaping into the unconditioned. If you want to see that explanation in detail, if you have the connected discourses of the Buddha, look in the back notes to chapter 45. The same formula comes in connection with each of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. And there you get all details of the commentarial way of explanation. Okay, before I ask the questions, let's just wrap up the sutta. Okay, so while pain, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not develop these enlightenment factors, there are no pain, vexation, or fever in one who develops them. These are called the taints that should be abandoned by developing. Then conclusion. When, for a bhikkhu, the taints that should be abandoned by seeing have been abandoned by seeing, when the taints that should be abandoned by restraining have been abandoned by restraining, when the taints that should be abandoned by using have been abandoned by using, when the taints that should be abandoned by enduring or by patience have been abandoned by enduring, when the taints that should be abandoned by avoiding have been abandoned by avoiding, when the taints that should be abandoned by removing have been abandoned by removing, when the taints that should be abandoned by developing have been abandoned by developing, then he is called a bhikkhu who dwells restrained with the restraint of all the taints. Actually, he's one who is kinasava, who destroys all the taints. He has severed craving, flung off the fetters, and with the complete penetration of conceit, And here we have that word abhisamaya. This is Shen, one, Shen, one. Complete penetration of conceit. He has made an end of suffering. Here, very clearly, the Buddha is now describing the Arahant. And so the development of the 7 enlightenment factors is what is necessary to move from the stage of stream enterer, one who has abandoned certain taints or fetters by seeing, to the stage of Arahant. And the other 5 methods that come in between, those are the preparatory methods. That they provide the kind of supporting conditions for the cultivation of the 7 enlightenment practices. And now when all of these methods for developing the taints have been practiced, then one eliminates all of the taints and one becomes one who has made an end of suffering. And that's the end of the discourse. Okay, any questions? I ask Gary first. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think what it's referring to is, well, okay, taking any passage as an example, pain to be abandoned by enduring. While pain, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not endure such things, there are no pain, vexation, or fever in one who endures them. So those pains that do not arise in one who endures them, those are the pains that should be abandoned by enduring. Yeah, it doesn't actually. Do you have any idea about that? If we take pains in the sense of misfortunes, disturbances, so any disturbances, just taking pains to be abandoned by enduring, by patience. Okay, any pains in the sense of, or asavas in the sense of disturbances or misfortunes that might arise by one who doesn't have this patient endurance. They don't arise in one who can patiently endure. So those are the taints that should be abandoned by enduring. In that way, I think it would make sense. Without having, one doesn't have to connect it to the classical threefold taints, because those are not really eliminated by these methods. Yeah. Yeah, then those disturbances, one doesn't have the disturbances in the mind. Yes, the disturbance doesn't arise in the mind. Disturbance, upset, misery. Yeah, my explanation is a little tentative. I can't say that I have a definite systematic explanation. It is, I see the 3 terms, there seems to be an increasing degree of strength. Would you see that? From viveka to viraga to nirodha. But viraga and nirodha are also often close together. So once one reaches, yeah, I know that. I think one has to understand it in that way, because one can't see Nirodha, say it's Nibbana, under the path supporting it from beneath. When we have to see it in the sense. So one could also say that it is. This is a little speculative way to take it, but it is the existence of the unconditioned Nibbana which makes possible the 7 factors of enlightenment that lead to Nibbana, that makes possible the 8 factors of the Noble Path that lead to Nibbana. And so, in that sense, you could say that the 7 enlightenment factors or the 8 path factors are supported by Nibbana, which is Viraga and Nirodha, dispassion and cessation, or also Viveka, seclusion, dispassion and cessation. But my explanation is the speculative way to make sense out of it. But until somebody comes along with a better idea, I won't give it up. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I see vexation and fever as being mutually exclusive, almost like opposites. As I explained before, vexation I see as representing the pole of aversion, ill will, dislike, or the state of unhappiness, misery that arises through this rejection, dislike, aversion. And fever, that's the burning of craving, of desire. But taint, if we take it in that broad sense, could even include both of them. And this is an interesting point. I didn't bring this up. Asava is separate. The Gata Parilaha forms a compound called a Skanda compound. In fact, one could even interpret, if you just stick to the Pali, you could even see the Gata Parilaha not as 2 things separate from Asava, but as being an elaboration of Asava. Yeah. And this is an interesting point. In the standard passage about sense restraint, okay. Well, it's another technical point. Maybe I won't bring this up. Okay, I will, but I won't use the Pali, because then you have to explain just how verbs are formed. Okay, it says that for one who dwells without sense restraint, abhija domanassa, that abhija is longing or craving, and domanassa is dejection, unhappiness, and bad, unwholesome states flow in to one who dwells thus. And the verb there, would flow in, is related to the noun asava. Anu asaveyum. And the root is sav, to flow, with the prefix a. The 2 prefixes, anu plus a, plus the root sav. Anu plus a plus sav, to flow in and along with. So the point is that here we have longing and dejection flowing into the mind, And that would support the idea that vexation and fever are the asavas, not things additional to the asavas. Okay, 8:30, it's really time that we have to close. Yeah, that's an important question. We go to Sutta number 117. Yeah, that's a very tricky sutta for me. Sutta number 117, the Discourse on the Great 40, Mahatatarika Sutta. Then the sutta that I took off the list, now I found the proper place for it. Yeah, sutta number 66 that I took off from section 5, that will come in at the end of section 6. That will now come after Majjhima number 77. Then we go to Majjhima number 66. Oh yeah, I eliminated that too. For now, maybe later we'll take it. It was too early to put it in that place. It was too early. Okay, so we close by quickly sharing the mirror. Akasata Chabumata Deva Nagam Hetika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Nagam Hetika Punyantang Anumoditva Chiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyantang Anumoditva Tirang Rakantu Manparang Eta Vata Cham He Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Deva Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Eta Vata Cham He Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Bhuta Anumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Eta Vata Cham He Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya